In March of 1978, there was a quasi-governmental trip to Cuba planned by the Carter administration. There were actually two trips, one of businessmen from the East Coast and one of businessmen from the West Coast. And in the West Coast group, Senators George McGovern and Hubert Humphrey helped select the crowd who went on this trip, sponsored by a travel group with ties to the American government. In 1978, we were in the depths of the boycott of Cuba. And so we went down on a chartered jetliner after being briefed by the State Department because the U.S. had no embassy or anything in Cuba. They operated through a charge d'affaires who was in the Swiss embassy in Havana. I was selected by Senator Humphrey as the co-chairman of the group, and another Los Angeles lawyer, Charles Manat, was selected by Senator McGovern to be the other co-chairman. So we went to Cuba. It was very backward in 1978. It looked like all the cars had come from the most isolated parts of America. We went to the Trotsky Tractor Works, the Stalin Steel Mills, the Krupskaya Hospital. I mean, it was communist propaganda at its highest, and you were not allowed to go any place you wanted. You came out of the hotel in the morning, got on a bus, and you went to a controlled location. Then you had a lunch, and you saw another location, drove through the sugarcane fields, etc., and came back. All this was well worth it because the last night of the trip, we had dinner with the big fella himself, with Fidel Castro. When he came into the room, most of us were quite impressed. He was a tall man and was wearing a military uniform, a dress uniform, smoking a cigar, and he was down smoking the butt of the cigar. And I thought it was odd at the time that here was this man who had the greatest cigar manufacturing enterprise in the world, was smoking that cigar all the way down to the butt like this, and he squinted as he lit it again to get the last few puffs out of the cigar. But when we sat down, I sat on one side of him as the co-chairman, and Chuck Manat sat on the other side. I had taken along 2 baseballs for my stepsons, Sean and Ryan Doheny, and I asked Castro to sign them. He lit up like a Christmas tree because he was a baseball freak. I knew this ahead of time. He was a great Cincinnati Reds fan because he had lived in Ohio for part of his life. He spoke fluent English, although he didn't speak it to us. He spoke through a simultaneous interpreter who was quite good. He signed the baseballs, Con Aficionado Marzo 1978, Fidel Castro. I brought it home to the boys, made them swear that they would keep them in a safe place, but one of the boys, Ryan Doheny, played catch with his and lost it in the backyard someplace of the house he was living in at the time. So only one exists to this day, which of course will be quite valuable when Fidel passes away. The conversation was free-flowing. The food was ample, large shrimp and lobsters on the table while the population was starving. the boycott was doing nothing to affect the leadership. It was then I realized that boycotts are imposed to make the imposing parties people feel good, had no practical effect. Fidel never missed a meal or a glass of wine or a fine cigar, but the average guy on the street was scraping around like mad to get enough to eat. During the conversation, one of the members of our group delivered the official message from the American State Department, ill-advised as it was, in my opinion. He said, "Presidente, if you will get your troops out of Angola and Mozambique, the United States will consider making capital investments in Cuba in the form of roads and dams, etc." Well, it was about as close to a bribe, a naked bribe, as you could have. And Fidel responded, "Oh no, we're in Angola and Mozambique." These were the two places where there was great guerrilla warfare in 1978. We're in those two countries at the invitation of our socialist brothers, and we're going to stay until we get rid of the colonial oppressors, Portugal in both countries, and which they eventually did because it became too expensive to sustain the war, just like us some years before in Vietnam. And so that diplomatic message went nowhere. However, there was one humorous episode. At the end of dinner, a waiter came with a silver tray piled with a large pile of long, thin cigars tied at the end. And Chuck Manette took one cigar, bit off the end of it, the tied portion, spit it out or else placed it someplace. I didn't see what he did. And Fidel looked down his nose at him about how gauche this was. And then when he came to me, the waiter, I said, "Oh my God, Lanceros cigars," I knew from the shape. And Fidel lit up. He was so happy because he was giving something to somebody who appreciated, and he gave this gesture. And I can tell you, you can fit 14 Lanceros between your middle finger and your thumb. And as I'm shoving them in my jacket pockets, I'm running through the names of the judges in Los Angeles that I was going to hand these cigars to from Fidel Castro's table.